February 21st, 1916. Verdun Sector, Meuse, France. The shelling began at 7:15. I know the time because someone shouted it, and because my watch stopped 2 minutes later when the ground lifted beneath us. There was no warning worth mentioning, no preliminary skirmish, no probing attack. Just sound, a wall of sound, tearing the morning apart. German artillery opened fire along a 20-kilometer front, from Bois de Cour to the Meuse River. Later, we learned this was Operation Gericht, the German plan to bleed the French army white at Verdun. At the time, all we knew was that the earth had turned violent. I was a stretcher bearer with the 72nd Infantry Regiment, attached to the 20th Corps. I had carried wounded men before. Champagne in 1915 had taught us that. But nothing prepared us for Verdun. The air smelled of damp soil and cordite. Within minutes, the trenches were unrecognizable. Timber supports collapsed. Duckboards shattered. Men were buried alive where they stood. German shells, 210mm, 305mm, and 420mm howitzers, including the massive 42-centimeter Big Bertha, fell without pause. They were not firing to destroy positions. They were firing to erase the map. Verdun had been fortified since the 19th century. We believed in its forts, Douaumont, Vaux, Souville. We believed in concrete and steel. That belief would not survive the week. The Bois de Cour was held by Lieutenant Colonel Émile Driant and his 2 battalions of chasseurs à pied. We heard later how they fought. Driant knew what was coming. He had warned Paris for months that Verdun was underdefended. He was ignored. When the barrage lifted briefly, German stormtroopers advanced. Infantry from the German Fifth Army, supported by flamethrower units. Men burned alive in their foxholes. Rifles jammed with mud and blood. Driant was killed on February 22nd, shot while directing a counterattack. His delay cost the Germans 2 full days. Those 2 days saved Verdun. We learned the news from a runner, his face gray with shock. Fort Douaumont had fallen, not after a heroic siege, not after days of assault. It was taken by a small German patrol, elements of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment, who found the fort almost undefended. Our command had stripped Verdun's forts of their garrisons in 1915, believing static defenses obsolete. Douaumont was the strongest fortress in the Verdun Ring. It fell without a major fight. When the news spread through the trenches, something broke inside the men. Not panic, something colder. The realization that the war we understood no longer existed. They say Verdun was saved by a road. The Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, ran from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, about 72 kilometers. Day and night, trucks moved forward. Ammunition, food, water, replacements. 1 vehicle every 14 seconds. I walked parts of it carrying wounded men backward, while the living marched forward past us. You could see it in their faces. They knew where they were going. Military police stood at intervals, pistols drawn, forcing broken vehicles into ditches so the traffic would not stop. Dust coated everything. The smell of oil, sweat, and fear never left your clothes. Without the Voie Sacrée, Verdun would have fallen by March. Verdun was not a single battle. It was hundreds of small ones. Hill 304. Mort-Homme, Dead Man's Hill. Côte de Loire. Each name became a graveyard. The Germans attacked relentlessly. When they took ground, French 75mm field guns and 155mm howitzers turned it into a moonscape. When we counterattacked, German artillery did the same to us. There was no maneuver, no breakthrough, only attrition. We stopped counting days. We counted bombardments. The wounded came in waves. Shrapnel wounds, crushed limbs, gas burns from phosgene shells. We had gas masks by then, but not always time to put them on. The worst were the buried men. Dug out hours later, lungs filled with dirt, eyes wild with terror. Some never spoke again. Fort Vaux did not fall easily. Major Sylvain Eugène Raynal commanded the garrison, about 600 men. Cut off, surrounded, bombarded by artillery, and attacked by German flamethrower teams, they held for 7 days. Inside the fort, there was no water. Men licked condensation from walls. Others drank from radiators. Wounded begged for death. When Raynal surrendered on June 7th, the German crown prince reportedly saluted him. Even the enemy understood what had happened there. By then, the Somme offensive had begun in the north. Verdun was no longer the only hell in France, but it remained the deepest. People imagine constant fighting. In truth, there were pauses, long, terrible pauses, where you waited for the next barrage. You cleaned your rifle with trembling hands. You wrote letters you knew would never be sent. Rats grew fat on the dead. Lice lived in every seam of your uniform. The smell, sweet, sickening, never left the air. Rain turned trenches into graves. Summer heat brought flies by the thousands. And still the guns fired. By July, some units lasted less than 2 weeks at the front before being rotated out, if anyone was left to rotate. In October, under General Robert Nivelle, the French counterattacked. This time, the artillery preparation was precise. New tactics, better coordination. Fort Douaumont was retaken on October 24, 1916. Fort Vaux followed on November 2nd. By December, the Germans had been pushed back close to their February positions. Verdun was saved, at a cost of approximately 300,000 dead and over 700,000 casualties, French and German combined. I left Verdun in December 1916. The landscape was unrecognizable. No trees, no villages, just craters filled with frozen water and twisted iron. They say Verdun became a symbol. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. But symbols are for those who were not there. For us, Verdun was the sound of shells that never stopped, the weight of wounded men on your shoulders, and the knowledge that survival was mostly luck. When the war ended in 1918, Verdun remained scarred, and so did we. I still hear the guns sometimes. They never really stopped.